Hello and welcome to this presentation, Energy, the Challenge, the Opportunity. I'm Peter Rolton, the CEO of the Rolton Group and Director of Cool Planet Technologies, a renewable energy company. I'm a built environment engineer and a member of the government's Renewables Advisory Board. In the past, our traditional abundance of fossil-based fuel sources has made us complacent as a nation about energy supplies. All that has changed. However, the level of concern about energy requirements and their effect on the environment are matched only by the rising levels of confusion about what's happening and what needs to be done. History is littered with predictions and opinions that are proved, with hindsight, to be spectacularly wrong. It doesn't really matter now whether people in the past failed to understand the impact of the computer or the telephone. The difference today is that we have no room for error. We cannot afford to mismanage the energy problem. This presentation sets out the challenges and the opportunities posed by the very real energy problems that we all face. Our ability to rise to challenge and grasp the opportunities will materially affect the way in which we and all our descendants live and work. As an engineer, I'm used to dealing with large, complex problems, working with the numbers, analysing the situation and creating solutions. This one has all the look of a perfect storm. 4 key factors have come together to create a situation that's far more threatening than their impact would have been individually. Let's take a look at them, one by one. Right across the world, we're running out of fossil fuels, oil, coal and gas. This is a finite resource, and since the mid-90s, new discoveries have failed to keep up with demand, and reserves are falling globally. In the UK too, the clock's ticking for fossil fuels. Our gas reserves will last for about 10 years, and oil will give out 3 years later. What's more, 40% of gas is used in power generation. And as for coal, we already import far more than we mine in the UK, and most of that is used in power generation too. In the UK, the few pits left in operation have dwindling reserves. It's very uncertain how viable it would be to reopen old pits or to mine any untapped sources, most of which are at the bottom of the sea. We don't help ourselves either. Think of Britain and it's hard not to conjure up images of national stereotypes. There are obvious ones, like the humble cuppa, the Tower of London, roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, cricket, fish and chips, Big Ben, the London bus. But how about this? It's a domestic scene that's so ordinary that maybe you won't even spot the icon. It's up there on the wall, the gas-powered boiler. As a nation, we are wedded to the domestic boiler. But if we're going to embrace sustainability and rid ourselves of our reliance on energy from fossil fuels, it either has to run on biogas or it has to go. Once you can no longer generate your own energy, you're at a disadvantage. Even the US, once rich in resources, now imports 70% of its oil, making it energy dependent on foreign countries. In the future, the UK will look mainly to countries such as Russia, Malaysia, Qatar, Egypt and Algeria for our gas. And within 20 years, given current consumption, all the world's remaining oil reserves will be in the Middle East. However, it's quite possible that countries will start to reduce their production in order to either eke out their reserves for a time when scarcity will drive prices even higher, or, more likely, to retain a degree of energy independence for themselves. Oil will become a resource beyond price. Many of the old certainties of energy supply have gone, and we can no longer expect energy to turn up on our doorstep like the daily pint of milk once did. In times of shortage or crisis, energy suppliers follow the money, and the highest bidder will take their pick. We have already seen situations where resources destined for one country are simply redirected en route and delivered to a higher bidder. As fossil fuel reserves dwindle, supplies will only diminish. It's not hard to see how a poor country could start a cross-border war to grab energy. The security of supply to the UK looks to be seriously compromised. It's a hostage to fortune. As finite resources become scarcer, countries become more desperate to hold what they have or to gain some more. As the Nobel Peace Prize of 2007 recognised, global warming and energy issues are potential cause of international instability and wars. The award was presented jointly to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Al Gore for their efforts to develop and spread greater knowledge about man-made climate change and to lay the foundations for the measures that are needed to counteract the change. The Nobel Committee said that extensive climate change could threaten the living conditions of much of mankind by inducing large-scale migration and creating greater competition for the Earth's resources. Such changes, said the committee, would place heavy burdens on the world's most vulnerable countries with increased danger of violent conflicts and wars with and between states. The smart money has to be on energy independence for UK plc. Security of supply is now a major problem all over the world, with the result that energy will continue to be a highly aggressive competitive market. For that reason, energy independence is vital for our country. So now we have dwindling reserves, scarcity of new resources, and the consequent rise in prices. This is where affordability becomes a problem. The 1973 oil crisis and the miners' strike the following year both showed how society needs access to affordable energy to sustain economic growth. Economic growth fell back, the economy stalled, and a recession characterised by stagnation and inflation soon followed. As prices rise, fuel poverty, the need to spend at least 10% of your income just to keep warm, becomes a fact of life for the most vulnerable members of society. Historically, energy prices in the UK fell for some time, and people became used to paying less for their energy. Now the pendulum has swung back and prices are fast outstripping the rate of inflation, just at a time when there is a global food price crisis as well. We have always taken affordable energy for everyone as a fact of life. Once people can no longer afford heating, lighting or food, we will begin to understand just how lack of access to affordable energy can be socially destabilising. Climate change is the final part of our perfect storm. The Stern report in 2006 said that climate change could create the greatest market failure ever seen. The report showed how extreme weather patterns can trigger a 1% global fall in GDP. A 2 to 3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature could reduce global economic output by 3%. This chart, taken from the Stern report, shows how temperature changes could affect the world, but it failed to spell out the appalling human cost of climate change. We see falling crop yields and water shortages. Great cities have traditionally grown up as trading centres beside rivers and seas. However, rising water levels will also threaten the existence of places like New York, London, Shanghai and Tokyo. Africa could face terrible droughts, but there could also be dreadful consequences closer to home. In the UK, we tend to forget just how far north our country lies. And that's because the effect of the Atlantic THC, the system that creates the movement of warm water from the west of the ocean to the east, and the consequent movement of cool water back again. The effects of this are remarkable. Boston in the USA is almost 10 degrees of latitude south of London, yet it gets about 3.5 feet of snow every year. You might think that Carlisle in the winter can be cold, but Carlisle is as far north as Moscow, where the temperature in January drops to minus 16 centigrade. As the Stern report points out, a 5-degree rise in temperature would trigger the kind of large-scale, irreversible climate shift that would see the UK experience in Russian winters. In the worst-case scenario, GDP would plummet by 20%, triggering a global economic crisis. In effect, the world's economy would stall. In a globalised world where, typically, a financial crisis on one side of the Atlantic can trigger an instant panic on the other side, this isn't good news. What was first dismissed as the credit crunch is now seen for what it actually is, a global recession. What we have to understand is that there's only one economy for all of us these days. It's the global economy, and there is only one climate. So, what are we to do? We need to deal with all 4 elements of the perfect storm. We have to acknowledge that fossil fuels aren't the way forward. We have to replace them with renewable energy sources. Secondly, we must secure energy supplies for UK plc. And to protect the country and all our people, we must also ensure that the energy we provide is affordable. And while we're at it, we have to save the planet. Oh, one last thing, there isn't much time. We've got to do all of this